Welcome everyone in our second SEFI at Work session. And this is from the series Methods in Engineering Education Research, offered to you by the Special Interest Group in Engineering Education Research. So this is an initiative of our Special Interest Group that's in particular being executed by Jan, by Esther, and by myself. So to remind you of the focus of this series, we want to help you in discovering research methods in engineering and education research and to get a more thorough understanding. So we do that by offering the floor to researchers who have been doing high impact publications and research with a very solid methodology. So we want to challenge these people to share their insights in engineering education research. And we really want to get you insights that go beyond just textbook information. So we want to have like a feeling that people share what they have been doing, like you would be sharing with some colleagues at a coffee machine, maybe their frustration in using a particular research methods, or their discovery, how fruitful the approach was, etc. It will also offer you the opportunity to get to know these researchers and of course to connect with other people here in the engineering education research community. So today it's our pleasure to introduce you Patric Wallin, and he will be talking about exploring reflective diaries using thematic analysis. We already had one seminar before. You can also still find the recording and the slides on our webpage. And we can already announce you our next seminar, which will be for the 16th of November by Christian Kautz on research students' reasoning. And of course, we will also repeat our nice initiative of last year, where we'll give the floor to the best research paper from the SEFI conference. And I hope you're all working hard on finishing your SEFI papers by the deadline, I think in 10 days?
Yeah.
10 days. Okay, Esther, maybe you want to say something to introduce Patric still?
Yes, so it's a very nice being able to introduce Patric Wallin. I personally have read not all, but some of his work. Patric works at the Department of Education and Lifelong Learning at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Norway, of course. And he has some interesting work about balancing the relationship between teachers and students in the classroom, and also enabling spaces for the students to develop themselves. The work that Patric is going to talk about today, which is on reflective diaries, was published in European Journal of Engineering Education in 2018. And then the focus of that paper was using thematic analysis. So we'll hear from him today, and that's all I'll say for now. So Patric can say something a bit more about himself and the work he does, and I'll leave it to you, Patric.
Thank you very much. I will start sharing my screen here.
And I'll share the link of the paper for those of you in the chat. The other thing to say, perhaps, sorry, before Patric starts, is if you have any questions throughout the talk, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on them, and then hopefully we'll have a good discussion with Patric.
Great, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to talk about this study. So let's see. Yeah, so this is a paper that you referred to. This is from 2017, I think. It kind of was part of my PhD studies, and then it was published after that time, together with Tom Adawi, who was my supervisor. So very briefly, you said, yeah, I'm working now as an associate professor at NTNU in Norway. I did my PhD at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden, in Gothenburg, within bioscience, and then a specialization in educational science. And I have a background in biomedical engineering and mechanical engineering. So I'm originally from Germany, and then I moved to Sweden, and now I'm in Norway. And also moving a little bit more from engineering to more general university pedagogy during the last 3-4 years, but still working quite closely together also with engineering departments here at NTNU. So just to give a little bit of frame of what I'm doing now. So now my work is more concerned with critical pedagogy as an entry point to explore how to create educational spaces in higher education and how traditional student-teacher positions can be challenged through partnership. And by reconsidering the relationships then between teaching and research to re-establish the university as a place for collaboration between students and academics. So this is what I'm doing now. So what I'm going to talk about lies a little bit before this. I'm still using reflective diaries and I'm still using the methodology, but the focus has changed slightly. So when I started with the reflective diaries, the idea or the main motivation was that what we need to be aware of what we're teaching today should help students to solve problems of tomorrow, which means that they need to be able to adapt to new technologies, different cultural norms and values, change policies, alter demands and desires, new restrictions, and so on. So the ability to reflect is quite central, I would argue, both about the process of learning, so what you're actually doing and how you learn, reflecting upon that, but also about the topic or the disciplinary stuff. So how are we working together? How are we reflecting about the solutions that we choose in a project, for example? So with this as a background, we then thought, okay, I was interested in having a methodology and an approach that allows me to study not only what the students know at the end of a course or in the middle of a course through interviews, but following along. And the main motivation for that was that if you think about it, if you have a challenge that you encounter, you would normally think that this is the biggest problem that you have right now. So it feels quite big. Once you have overcome and solved it, you will reflect back on it and you think, okay, this wasn't so bad. I managed to come over it and I solved it and I got along. It's a little bit like when we're in high school, the next exam is the most difficult thing that will happen. And then we come to university and the next exam will be the most difficult thing that we have. And then there comes the master's thesis and the PhD thesis and so on. But when we are looking back, it is quite different. So I wanted to have a methodology that can capture kind of that dynamic and follow along rather than only having endpoints or middle points in that sense. So that was kind of the motivation to think about how can we use reflective diaries where students more continuously write. Another really great thing about reflective diaries, especially if students write them digitally, is you save a lot of hassle with all the transcription and stuff like this. I mean, you get what you get out of it. It's like clean written data that you can start to analyze and reflect upon and work with, which is quite practical. And I mean, I think it's still, especially in large cohorts, I think that is quite an interesting approach. So working with reflective diaries has then this double dimension. And I think we mentioned that in the paper as well. There's a CDOI paper as well, where we, I think, discuss this in a little bit more detail. And this can be a challenge. I normally would see it more as an advantage. But there are certain challenges that one can, or limitations that can rise. So reflective diaries will always both be promoting student reflective capacity, so they will engage in that, but they will also be a tool for probing. And it's very difficult to decouple those two. So, and I think it's important to be aware of it, because this is not, I mean, I'm not interested in saying that reflective diaries do something and then decouple the probing and the promoting stuff from each other. So I think that, okay, this is actually quite nice, because it means that students engaging in reflective writing will both get out something for them, the promoting part, but also it will allow me to probe the learning and get something out, both with respect to feedback to the students, but also with respect to research and course development. So I normally try to tell the students that I work with that, look, this is something that is important for you, and I also think it's interesting to read your diaries. So we both benefit from doing it. And then there's this, in that particular paper, then we couple the reflective diaries to formative assessment and to self-regulated learning. So the idea is a little bit that if we go back here, the probing part and the feedback, the reflective diaries allow us to see things that might be difficult to see otherwise, both in when we are tutoring project work, or if we work in other constellations. And it gives a very good basis to use for formative assessment and providing feedback. And kind of supports the self-regulated learning part. And I will come back to the self-regulated part and when I talk a little bit about the findings and what might be challenging here. So going into detail now about what we actually did, it was the students were writing reflective diaries every week. Normally towards the end of the week, they were prompted. So we designed particular prompts to help the students reflect upon. And those were structured in the sense that there was a theme, like your biggest challenge this week. And then there were particular questions, and I will show you in a minute how those looked like. We also alternated between general prompts on learning experience and challenges. Those were the same or similar, at least, every other week. And then in between, we had specific prompts that related to the project phases. So every other week, you would get something that, like at the beginning, was about the literature search, and then it would be about conducting experiments and so on. That would like kind of follow along. So there was a bit of familiarity and a bit of something new, and that altered all the time. And this is something that has been described in the literature as well. It's like kind of balancing those two. You don't want to repeat the same kind of prompts and questions all the time, but at the same time, some things like learning experience and challenges is something that reoccurs all the time. So it's nice to capture that as well. What we didn't, and I looked at the paper again yesterday, what we didn't show there was that we actually had individual interviews both in the middle and at the end. There was kind of, in addition, and it is kind of a part of a larger part of how of a larger project and data collection set. We didn't use it in that particular paper, but I used it in other studies. And the idea here was that using the diaries as an entry point to the individual interviews, so kind of taking them with me and having students reflect upon certain aspects of what they described in the diaries, and also having a possibility to clarify. Because one of the major problems with the diaries is when the students write, it's not, I mean, you can't ask follow-up questions in the same way as you can in an interview. So sometimes it might be difficult to understand what exactly do the students mean here. And it lies then on me as a researcher to interpret that. So combining that with the interviews, and there's, I don't remember his first name, Zimmerman, he has described that this diary interview methods quite neatly, I think, argues the same way that you can then kind of follow up and try to understand things in more detail. it also helped me to see if there's some kind of coherence between what the students write in the diaries and what they tell me in the interviews. So in kind of trying out this methodology, it really helped to understand that things are actually working the way they should. So when it comes to the diary prompt design, I think it's important to mention that when I used it, I was teaching the course as well. So I had very hands-on experiences. I did know where the students were, and that really, really helped. And also following up on that later, when I used reflective diaries here in Norway, I normally have been teaching myself. And that really helps because it kind of, I make the argument that it's kind of relational. So the student needs to trust you in writing those diaries, and they need to have a sense of that what they write is actually important and somebody reads it. And it also means that it's much easier for me to design questions on the fly and kind of adjusting them when working together with the students because I know where they are. But the general categories were the same. So what we did is we identified topics of interest and took up to different phases within the project, things you pick up when the students' discussions, generic aspects of learning, general concepts of importance for your course. So those things, I did have the contextual information from working in the course. And then there are 4 general categories, which are more like global in that sense, that I wanted to cover in each prompt, and that is what has happened. So there's more like a descriptive kind of part. How did you approach the situation? So what did you actually do? Why is it important? I mean, in what kind was this meaningful for you? And how did you learn from it? So the last one is more kind of pointing towards the future. What do you take away from it? From experience, I would say that the last one is probably the one that is most difficult for the students to write about. They're quite good at describing the situation and what has happened. How they work, they also quite often write quite a lot about why it's important. It is more difficult, and then what they have actually taken away from it is probably even more difficult for them. And then, so based on those, I then have designed like specific prompts. And then, like, if we take an example here for a general prompt, this week's learning experiences. So that would be the prompt. And then the support questions would be, what was the most important thing you realized this week? Why do you believe it is important? What made or helped you to realize this? What can you do to create more such learning experiences? So originally, and I still have that as an idea, and I always tell the students that I work with that you don't think so much about the questions in themselves and don't like answer question for question, but rather try to write towards a prompt. That doesn't really work so well. I mean, especially with engineering students, it's like they will answer each question. That's it. But it's good. I mean, still, and I can show you an example later. There is some development of the reflective capacity and the reflective skills that they develop. Another example here from a specific prompt and related to the project phase, learning from the scientific literature. What was the most difficult part of getting information from the scientific literature related to your project? Why was it difficult, and how did you approach the challenge? How did you work with the literature? What was your main learning outcome from reading the articles? Why do you think literature search and review is important? How do you think this will help you throughout the project? So just to give you a rough idea of how one can design those prompts. But I think having those over here, the topics of interest and the general categories, and then having the contextual information really helps to do that kind of work. So then when it comes to the analysis, as I said, we have the promoting dimension and we have the probing dimension. So when it comes to promoting, the what has happened question kind of can relate to planning and cognitive. Yeah, you see that here. And if we go here, just to give you an example, one of the biggest challenges when starting a new project is to classify the information due to the large amount of information that exists on the network. It is important to classify and select the ones that are relevant to your project. If we then look at the promoting part, I would make the argument that writing the reflective diaries helps the students to identify and become aware of the challenges they are facing, as they need to think through them and write about them. They need to analyze the current situations in order to be able to plan their actions. So raising the awareness and actually writing down what has happened and what is challenging for me right now kind of helps them. And then if I'm not going to show that, but if you then look at how did you approach it, it kind of points towards what kind of cognitive strategies they use to approach that. And then for the probing parts, the reflective diaries can help teachers to become aware of the challenges that students experience during a project. So this information can be helpful to design appropriate scaffolding for the students' learning process and provide the right support to them, both right there and then, but also on a more wider scale on, okay, how can we maybe think about this next year when we're running the course again. So this is a bit complicated, but this is kind of what the analysis then looked like. So one of the things that, yeah, I will talk you through it. So we have the students' accounts, the raw data. So those are the reflective diaries on the left hand. And then comes the deconstruction part. So the color coding and the units of meaning. So like a normal thematic analysis in that sense, going through the data, kind of deconstructing the material, finding parts across the different accounts. Then in the next step, reconstructing those into categories, like you would normally do in thematic analysis. What are the topics that go across? What we then did, and I don't think that we described that in that particular paper, but I think this is interesting just because this is something that I played around with quite a lot afterwards, is one of the problems here is that when we do this deconstruction and then reconstruction into categories, what we miss is the individual pathways and the individual kind of contextual boundaries that the students are working in, because it's kind of part of the deconstruction thing. I mean, like we construct categories that go across. And so what I did afterwards, and some of the works that I've published later, was to reconstruct them from the categories back to individual students, trying to figure out those pathways. And that was quite interesting, I think, to take that step and look at the pathways. And I will show you another figure towards the end, why I think this is interesting. When it then comes to the thematic analysis part, like going back and forth from reading the data, relating it to the literature, finding new inspirations there. I mean, this was a quite elaborate process of going back and forth. And then again, as I was teaching the course, I would normally read the diaries continuously, always when they came in. And I was kind of like, it was quite interesting to see how the students were reflecting and what they had to say. So I was quite familiar with the entire material. And then after the course was finished, going then into the analysis, in a more structured way and working more systematically with it. But I already had quite a good idea of all the data and the people behind. And I think that helped. And then one can argue that it might be difficult to have the necessary distance to the subject and to the work. But I would make the argument that for me, I think it was really, really helpful to have all the contextual information and to know the students quite well doing the analysis. Yeah, so just very briefly to finishing off here, I think what is important is for students to recognize the purpose of writing reflective diaries. This is a quote from one of the students. At the beginning, I thought about it like an assignment. I didn't know what to write. Later on, when I had a real problem, then it helped. So I think recognizing that students have different entry points when it comes to writing reflective diaries is important. I had one student who said, "This was so great. I wish somebody had told me about this before. And I'm definitely going to do this more on my own as well." But not all students are there. Personal preferences. For me, it is difficult to write these kinds of things. I prefer to write more specific things. For example, what did you feel? And these things, it feels a bit strange to write about them. I don't know what is the question, what you are looking for. I understand that you are not looking for any specific answer, but it's still strange. So acknowledging the cultural backgrounds, the personal preferences is really, really important because people have very different ideas about writing those kind of things, in particular in a higher education landscape where we also then have to deal with all the kind of authority idea of, okay, what am I going to tell a professor and how I'm going to write to them and that kind of stuff. So here's another one. In my country, people often do not care what you think, but here in Sweden, it is different. Here, people want to know your opinion, point of view. I think this is good. This is a way to get a lot of ideas and change things if needed to make it good for everybody. There needs to be some kind of variation. I mentioned that before. There were some weeks where the questions were very similar to the questions the week before, so I don't know what to write. Yeah, it doesn't always work, but the idea was to having these alterations would help. And feedback. I was looking forward to bring up some quotes during the feedback session. I thought you were going to do that. So this was relating to the interviews. And again, I have been using diaries now in courses with up to 200 people. And then it's difficult to read all of them in detail. And I don't provide feedback to everybody, but I will take some of the things that come up there and mention them in class, not particular to that person, but in more general. I see from the diaries that a lot of you were struggling with that particular concept. And it makes the students feel that somebody is actually reading it and that it matters what they're writing. Yeah. Very briefly, one of the major ideas that we had was, what we saw was, we often talk about self-regulated learning strategies, and that's important. The problem might be that it's not only the strategies. So you might have strategies or you don't have, but if you have a very different idea of what learning and what knowledge are, it doesn't really help you to have the right strategy. So using the diaries really set focus on that you can do something up here on the epistemological scale, working with the concept of knowledge and learning, and then building upon self-regulated learning strategies later. Yeah, so I said about the pathways. So what I'm interested in now and still am is how those pathways of both teachers and students are entangled with each other and trying to understand those in more details. And I think there really the reflective diaries can help. Yeah, I think I will Be aware that student needs to learn to reflect and practice, appreciate and see the value of reflecting once they start. So normally the students will do that. Reflective diaries promotes the development of metacognitive abilities. That is what we saw. And using them, I think it's important to explain the purpose, create environments and allows free reflections. Also kind of model that in the practice. Be critical, reflective yourself. And there will be large variations, just the way it is. But I still think that this is an interesting way that is kind of complementary to interviews and focus groups, and can be quite interesting to explore in many different cases. So I will stop there, and then we can take some questions.
Sorry, it was a good plan to unmute. Thanks very much, Patrick. That was really, really interesting. And we have quite a few questions already on the chat. So let me just scroll through them. One quick question here, see if you confirm. The students, at what level were they? These students were in their studies?
So in that particular study that is published in ECHE, those are master students, fourth year. But I have been using diaries also with first year students.
Okay, and one other question in here from Valencia. I'm not quite sure. It's about how would you approach the design and admin of the probes for projects where there are no phases or no clear phases. You have apparently some very distinctive phases in the project. What would you say is the case if that's not the situation?
So it depends a little bit upon, I think, like we had that idea about the phases from the start, and then we were adjusting all the time. So I needed to switch prompts kind of and adjusting slightly every single week so that it would fit. But having kind of a battery of prompts that are prepared and then choosing which will fit and maybe making small adjustments, I think would be a good way to start. And then, I mean, it gets easier. I mean, now that I have a couple of prompts that I can just reframe and reuse, it's quite easy.
Yeah, thanks. And one thing in terms of you mentioned, and there's a question here from Kurt about the students. You mentioned in your findings the students found sometimes difficulty in what to write, and one of the questions here is about whether the students are trained in writing the diaries. You also mentioned you're now using these in first year with first year students, so it will be interesting to know. I mean, perhaps final year students or fourth year students are a bit more mature and they are more happy to embrace these. They might have a better grasp of what is it that is the required thing. What happens with the first years, and how is it that do you give them instructions on how long they have to be the reflections, and how do you kind of get them into the habit, I guess is the question from Kurt, of the questions.
Yeah. So yes, I agree. I mean, it is quite difficult for students, and I don't necessarily think that it has so much to do if they are first or fourth year students, if they are not used to reflecting and writing reflective text. That is a really challenge, and I see that in particular in maybe the technical disciplines. That challenge is even bigger because you're trained to writing kind of descriptive and kind of distance yourself from the text. What I do is that I think, okay, this is great. We need to start somewhere, and you need to start writing somewhere. But then I will give feedback to the students as well and said, like, this was really interesting. It would be interesting if you could expand on that. So another way to do that is, yes, you have the prompts, but you can also kind of, depending on how many students you have, you can do some kind of follow-up. So I've been doing that from time to time, and I think picking up a theme that they have been talking about the week before and said, yeah, this was really interesting how you described it, but can you say something more about how you felt about it or something like that? And that kind of helps them. And then just engaging in the reflective writing also really helps. And then I also have to say, so when I use reflective diaries, they are voluntary. So I've never used them as mandatory or as grading or anything like that. This has also something to do with from the ethical part for the research kind, because it would be kind of difficult otherwise. But talking about it really, really helps, and saying, like, explaining the students over and over again that there's value of doing this, and there's value for them and for me, really has helped. So again, I think what I said at the beginning, it's really relational. So you need to have some kind of relation, and you need to build that to the students, because they need to trust you in order to open up and write those things. But then again, what I think is good about reflective diaries in comparison to interviews is the students are to some extent in control, because they can choose what they want to share and what they don't want to share. And they can think through it before they press send.
And Esther, can I ask Kurt maybe himself, because Kurt, if I'm correct, he's also using reflection themselves by a student in his research. So probably his question comes from a kind of his own experience. So maybe Kurt, could you clarify where your question comes from, and if I'm right that it indeed comes from your own experience?
You're mute, Kurt.
We don't hear you, Kurt.
Okay, hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So it's true, it comes from my own experience. I started using reflective diaries in a first year course, and also with second year students now. And yeah, what I noticed is that it's difficult for them to, what you explained, to engage. And I have to admit that like giving them feedback on those parts of the reflective diaries is not something that we're doing in our case at the moment. So I think that's one of the interesting things that is required to build trust and to help them in getting better in writing and reflecting. Yeah.
And perhaps both Patrick and Kurt, because you've used this before, one question here is about, to get them into the notion of what is it that you actually write and how you write it, perhaps, do you give them examples to start with? Do you share Patrick, you mentioned the notion of the idea that you have to let them trust you, and you have to also get them into that comfort zone or that safety zone where they're happy and they feel in control on what to share. But again, for engineering students and in sciences, generally speaking, they find it difficult they're more used to writing equations and so on, and numbers. So how do we just kind of break that barrier? Do you just kind of, well, here are some examples, for instance, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that is a challenge. I normally don't provide any examples to the students, partially because I think it's difficult, because I would need to get them from somewhere, and it kind of feels strange. And I also think that it's important to acknowledge that those are individual, and they will look very different from person to person, and some will write quite elaborate, like long and gloomy, whereas others will be quite concise and to the point. But I think, again, like helping them to find value in it, and also say, okay, can you go look back and read those your own entries again, is quite interesting for them. Yeah. I mean, I do have, when I was teaching here in Trondheim, we do this in a slightly different way. So we have individual reflective diaries, but we also then have group reflective activities, and we have what we call a process report, where the students actually then write a complete report about the entire process, that then in that particular case, the process report is also graded. So that is kind of a different level of how we use diaries there.
Thanks. Alexandra has a question here. You want to ask the question yourself, Alexandra, perhaps?
I had two questions. Well, actually, I had a suggestion concerning the assessment of how the students feel towards. For me, it's not clear exactly what is asked. How do you feel towards what? We also use, or we are trying to use portfolios in École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, so the engineering school in Lausanne in Switzerland. And we also have an assessment of emotions using epistemic emotions items from the Beck-Roon general framework of achievement emotions. It's one item assessed at different points of filling out a group process. So we work with portfolios as group, let's say, like a collaborative process. So from my point of view, I think it's important to give a certain direction to the students. If it's just a short prompt, one item, then to be general about it. The other thing that I was wondering about is this, I'm impressed by the interval of reflecting. I was wondering, is it too much of like taking the temperature on the process every week and giving prompts every other week? Did you measure, is this how it should be done? Is it more effective to do it longer, or what was your experience there?
I think it depends a bit on the size of the course and how much the students work. In this particular case, the students work quite intensely, so that makes sense to have that very short intervals. And then some weeks the reflections will be quite short, whereas other weeks they will be longer. That's just the way it is, so that worked quite well. But I mean, yes, there are other ways of doing it. There's also then the question of doing more like critical incident reflections, where when actually something is happening, you start reflecting. But I'm still interested in the more mundane kind of things, the everyday things that happen, rather than only the critical parts. Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, one needs to consider thinking about the course and the workload.
Thank you. And Karsten has also a question about, considering the course and so on. Karsten, you want to ask your question?
Yes. So my question raised up from the fact that I gave a course to future technology teachers. So it was, teacher education, but it's engineering education as well in this case. And so it was a course on inquiry-based learning, just slow with the wild horses. And I also asked them at several points in the course and realized that they need feedback and that I have to give them feedback. But on the other hand, in several development lines, it was quite the same feedback. So I asked myself, is it possible to kind of automate it with an assistant system, something like that? So what are the categories, Patric, that you used? Because what were those categories? I saw them earlier for coding.
Yes. So when it comes to feedback, I think one thing is like individual feedback. And I agree. I mean, this is quite difficult, especially in larger classes. I mean, it becomes really, really time consuming. I still think it's very valuable, but then thinking about how much resources one should use, that's difficult. My experience is that as long as the students feel that somebody's actually reading what they're writing, and that can be on a meta level of giving feedback on a more general, like I said, in the class where I had 200 students, I would then say, okay, I see a lot of you are struggling with certain concepts. I think that sometimes is enough. It's not the same. but it can help. The other thing, I'm posting a link here in the chat. We did play a little bit around with a machine learning system and an artificial intelligence part, where we tried to use Lectica. It's a platform that can grade how systematic your thinking is. It kind of is a bit strange. I'm not 100% convinced about the whole background theory and how it works, and there are a lot of ethical considerations here as well to take into consideration. But we did play a little bit around with that, and that system then can make recommendations automatically based on the text that students are writing. It kind of is analyzing that text and the complexity within the text, and then it recommends students to certain resources. It's interesting. It's also a bit frightening, I think, but it's an interesting. So there's a link if you want to read a little bit more about that.
Thanks.
And Greed also has a question here. Greed, you want to ask?
Yes, no problem. You told us that it's very important that students get information before they start reflecting and that they get enough exercises. Have you measured how the quality of the reflection exercises has improved while students have more and more experience?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on what we understand as measuring. So yes, I did some kind of I don't know if I would call it an analysis in that sense, but from what I see when I look and read through the reflective diaries, like from start to end from one particular person, I definitely see a development. But then it's very difficult to, at least I find that difficult to measure that in any kind of, okay, how would you describe that development? Yes, but I would make the argument that, yeah, definitely it's more descriptive at the start and it becomes more complex and reflective towards the end. And then you have students that start on a relatively high level where you might not see as much development, but they will stay there.
What can we do to help students to reach the more complex reflection from the start?
I think it will always take some time. So I don't necessarily think that it will be so easy to get them there right now, right there and then. And that is also why I would make the argument that it's quite important when working with reflective diaries that it's always a good idea to have several writing sessions within a course. And I've seen a lot of people using reflective exercises like once, and then it kind of is difficult because it's so different of a genre for the students to write in. So having that repetitively, I think, is quite important.
Thank you. Anna, you might want to comment on this because you have a comment on the chat about how you find differences in different students as well.
Oh, yes, sorry. No, it was indeed just, but I think it was related to a comment long ago, our conversation long ago. But indeed, we have noticed that we also use reflections in our education. And in our case, our students reflect every 2 weeks, reflect on learning and how they are achieving that intended learning outcomes that we have set for themselves. In our case, reflection on learning is one of the intended learning outcomes, so it's very specifically listed as part of our projects. And what we do notice indeed is that the way the students reflect and how deep they go in the reflections really varies depending on where the students come from, what is the background of the students and which program they come from. Our projects are interdisciplinary, so that's an extra challenge that we have, of course, is how do we balance that? And we also notice that the students, it's a learning process for them as well. So some students will join our project with a lot more expertise or experience in reflection. while for others is maybe the first time that they have really sat down to think about how they're learning and what they want to do next. But this does improve with the time. That's what we have also noticed ourselves.
Okay, thanks. Tina, you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to go back a little bit to using reflective diaries as a research method, because of course there was a kind of double goal, because you want to enhance reflection, you want to use it for your teaching. But then I was wondering, if we go back to using reflective diaries as a research method, then you already mentioned it's easy that you have it digitally in your case, so that you don't have to transcribe it anymore. But you still, as Karsten also already mentioned, you have to code it. So how hard was the coding process? What made it hard? Could you give us any hints on how to to support other researchers in this process? Yeah, so that was more like going back, like if we use reflective diaries as a research method, how difficult is it to extract the data from it?
Yeah. I think one of the difficult parts, as I briefly said when comparing it to interviews, is that you're not always sure of what the students are actually wanting to say. Mm-hmm. So there's I at least felt a large part of interpreting the student writing. And maybe reading stuff into it that isn't there, which I struggled with from time to time. And again, there's also, I said that one of the advantages is that being part of the course and knowing the students well gives me a lot of contextual information, and that helps. On the other hand, it kind of makes it difficult because I know the persons so well that are behind that writing. That will influence how I will approach the coding and the whole analysis part, and then want to make the argument that is a real problem. On the other hand, I think it kind of like having all that kind of information and kind of building it together is also interesting. One needs to deal with the challenges that come with it, but it's interesting. The other thing that I find challenging is that some of the things that are interesting are kind of across the diary. So you need basically to read the entire diary in order to understand. It's not so easy to get a particular quote and use it. So a little bit about when it comes like what the question before about measuring the development, that's really, really difficult for me to show. I mean, I can tell you, like, I think there's some development, but it's very difficult to illustrate in a qualitative sense with quotes and making that a solid analysis. So here I find that sometimes it's struggling because to some extent you have so much information, you have such a rich image of how the students have experienced, because I mean, we're talking about, for some of the students, I think 20 to 30 pages of reflective writing. You have quite of a solid understanding of what they have been struggling with. And now you want to take a particular quote to illustrate something. But then the reader doesn't have all the other information. So that I think was probably the most challenging part. So having a format where you can present that and doing justice to the information that you have, I think is difficult.
Patric, can I just, because I want to ask you this, I've been dying to ask you this actually. And then we'll have another question from Jan and comments from Alexandra. You mentioned that you did your thematic analysis, and later on you did your categorization, and eventually you started also looking at, in a way, at the narrative of the students, so individual students and what was it they were looking at. From the research perspective, I was just wondering whether at some point, or when you were looking at that, you had second thoughts about having used thematic analysis to start with, you know, the choice of of a methodology at the beginning, there are other things that potentially you could have used. And I wonder, what was it that drew you into using thematic analysis at first?
Esther, I'm going to be very impolite for a minute, because in fact, our time has ended and I don't want to oblige people to stay here. So is it okay for you that I do a small ending, but then we agree that if Patric is available, of course, yes, that we can stay a little bit longer for an informal discussion here in this room? It's okay for you?
For me, yes, fine.
Yes.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then
good.
I share my screen for a minute to just close. So remember, we're very thankful for these researchers coming here to share their experiences, like Patric has been doing, and we have upcoming on the 16th of November, Christian. If you want to provide feedback to us about this seminar and how we can improve it, you're very welcome to do so through this link for feedback, and I'll paste it for you in a minute as well in the, I'll paste it in a minute there for that you can provide your feedback in the poll everywhere. Then, as we already mentioned, quick reminder, don't forget to finish your papers for this upcoming SEFI conference, SEFI 2022. Thank you very much all for being here. As mentioned, we're having this very lively and good discussion, so you're welcome to stay in the more informal part afterwards. I'll stop the recording anyway, so that you can still hang around and share your experiences, discuss with Patric, and discuss with the others. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, thanks everybody for coming.